Good morning. Here's some context of the Civil War, what else is happening besides how it's impacting groups and all of the battles to know, and really it's the significance of the battles that you need to focus on. So obviously war starts with the election of 1860, but we are going to see another election in 1864. And this is Lincoln versus McClellan. Obviously, the Confederacy considers themselves a whole separate nation, and so they're going to be having their own thing going on down there with Jefferson Davis as president. They actually do 6-year presidencies, so he doesn't even finish his full term. So Lincoln is challenged by McClellan, who was a general who really wanted to end the war and sue for peace, was his main platform. And so you can see popular vote, he got a decent number, 45%, McClellan. But that was nowhere near the ability to get the 91% of Lincoln's electoral vote with 212. And so Lincoln wins the election. The big thing that influences this election is that right before voting, news of Sherman's sacking of Atlanta comes, and that his march down through Georgia to Savannah, march to the sea, really begins, and that really bolsters Union support, and they kind of see the war as ending soon, and so that really helps Lincoln gain re-election in 1864. Unfortunately, of course, he doesn't survive the entire term, because on April 14th, 1865, Lincoln is assassinated at Ford's Theater downtown in Washington, D.C. By John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. And we know that Lincoln dies, and that means that his vice president, Andrew Johnson, becomes president after that. So this happens like 3 or 4 days after the war officially ends, after Lee surrenders in Appomattox. So as the war is ending, Lincoln is assassinated. And there's debates about whether Lincoln would have treated Reconstruction the same way that Johnson did or not. It's all a what if, of course. But other things happening throughout the war in terms of foreign affairs, kind of think of this thematically. So the South really puts all of their eggs in one basket for King Cotton, thinking that cotton is going to continue to allow them to really help keep making money from Britain and France. But of course, we know that that doesn't work out so well, because Britain, especially, has the colonies of Egypt and India, both of which are major cotton producers. And so they're kind of like, Southerners, cotton, meh, we can get it from elsewhere. One big thing that does happen is called the Trent Affair. There were 2 Confederate diplomats on the boat USS Trent, or SS Trent, and it's heading towards Great Britain, and it's stopped by the blockade. And so there's this big debate over should the Union government seize them. And Lincoln decides to not, and allows them to continue to Great Britain because they were on a British ship, and he didn't want a international incident with Britain happening at the same time of the war. And he also understood that it really didn't make a difference whether there were Confederate diplomats in Britain, because after this, he pretty much is able to propose the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves, which Britain supports very well, because Britain has already outlawed slavery, and so that helps keep Britain from supporting the South. So for a number of reasons, Britain is not interested in helping the South and the Confederates. They get 1 or 2 ships from Britain during the war, but for the most part, foreign affairs for the Confederacy is terrible, and the Union, maintains good relations with Britain, a little bit with France, although their economic power has decreased. Politically, we are going to see some change during the war. We have the rise of not a party, but a faction called the Copperheads. They are vocal anti-war Northern Democrats who are especially going to support McClellan in his candidacy towards president in 1864. But we're going to see that they really become vocal in against everything that Lincoln does throughout the war. They are a small group, but they are very vocal, and so they are going to have some influence, especially when the war is not going so well. We are going to see drafts happen during the war. The Confederates actually have the first draft in April of 1862. They draft white men, ages 18 to 35, for a 3-year term, because they don't have enough men for their army, and pretty much never will. The Union is actually going to start a draft in March of 1863 for white men of ages 20 through 45. They later expand this to include African Americans. But you get a quota of troops from each congressional district. And the big thing is that you are allowed to pay for a substitute if you are wealthy enough. So if you pay $300, then they will find another man to take your spot. And this leads to a number of riots in big cities, especially the most famous is in New York City, because the Irish poor immigrants do not want to fight to free African Americans who would then compete with them for labor and cost less. So this is, of course, shown in the movie Gangs of New York, very well. Not entirely 100% historically accurate movie, but great movie to watch. And so that's going to be a big issue in the North, is how do we keep things calm while instituting a draft. Lincoln is also going to expand presidential power. Of course, due to the emergency of war, we saw some expansion of power with Andrew Jackson. But Lincoln is going to be kind of the next president to really expand power. We'll see later Theodore Roosevelt and then FDR really expand power as well, and then Nixon with Vietnam. So some of the things that they do, he suspends habeas corpus, or the right of appearance in court, and they jail people suspected of disloyalty. So this especially takes place in Maryland, as they're trying to, protect Washington, D.C. They try citizens in military tribunals instead of in civilian court. He expands the size of the army without congressional approval, which of course then he goes and asks Congress, will you approve this? And they say yes. He uses treasury funds to pay for a large army without congressional approval. And then of course the House comes back and approves it afterwards. And he orders the blockade of the southern ports without approval, which is going to be upheld by the Supreme Court in a court case. So all of these are done through things like executive orders, and many of them are going to be upheld through the courts and through Congress after the fact. But this is really the first time that we see a president acting alone without necessarily talking with Congress, which of course relates to current events, because it is January 2020, and we have seen President Trump order a drone attack on Iraqi Air Force Base, which killed an Iranian general. And then, of course, he did that without congressional approval. And really, it's Congress that declares war. And so Lincoln is kind of one of the starting factors. And we see this continuing, this idea of the war powers of presidents continuing all the way through to today. And it's still a debate. What can the president do in what they declare times of crisis or times of emergency without the approval of Congress? And so that's going to be one of those battles between the executive branch and the legislative branch that we're going to see throughout U.S. history. But this is another great start of it. We also see economic changes, and all of this kind of fits in the idea of while the cat's away, the mice will play. So the cat being the South, and the mice being the Northern senators who are kind of like, all right, they're gone. We can do whatever we want. Everything that the South had been blocking before, the Northern Congress is now going to do. So in terms of financing the war, they're going to pass the first federal income tax, which some people also see as an expansion of power. They're going to issue bonds, where government borrowing is the number one way that they pay for the Civil War. But that income tax is also going to not be renewed after the war. We won't get our official income tax that we pay today until the 16th Amendment later on in the 1900s. But they also issue a first paper money, the first federal legal paper money of greenbacks. Previously, each bank or each state had issued their own paper money. And so now we have one national paper money, which is going to end up looking like what we have today in wallets, or used to have in wallets now that we're going digital. They also pass a number of acts that are going to modernize Northern society. So one is the Morrill Tariff Act. So they're increasing the import tariff to protect Northern industry, which, remember, the South hated those tariffs. If you remember back to the days of Jackson and the Force Bill and all of those issues. And they're also going to pass the Homestead Act, which is going to give 160 acres of land to anyone or any family that is willing to live on the land for 5 years out west in the territories to help settle the territories, which of course would then move lots of Northerners to territories, which then become states and means more Northern-like states out west to kind of counter with people with anti-slavery attitudes to counter the Southern South. And the Homestead Act we'll talk about a lot more in Unit 6, but this is kind of when it starts because Southerners had been protesting it because there was no slavery involved at all. We're also going to see economically the Pacific Railway Act. They had started a discussion of this in 1854, but we're going to see that they actually passed the bill in 1862 to build the Transcontinental Railroad along a northern route. And we'll talk about this more in Unit 6, of course, but the Southerners have been pushing for that southern route for the, Gadsden Purchase and all of that. But we're going to see that they start laying the rails from two ends, one side starting in California, one side starting in Nebraska, and they meet in the middle in Utah in 1869, I believe, 79, something like that. Don't quote me on that. And so that's another thing that the Northerners are kind of like, well, the Southerners are gone. We can put it in Northern territory. And then we're also going to see a number of social changes based on the war, which you'll see with your chart as well. But one of the things not mentioned in the charts are land grant colleges. This was done by the Morrill Land Grant Act, where the federal government gave states a grant of land, which the state would then sell off to pay for federally sponsored colleges, mainly focusing on agricultural and science. So the first two colleges paid for by this were Michigan State and Penn State in those two respective states. And then they increased to about 26 colleges funded by 1873. So that includes closer to home, Virginia Tech and Maryland and West Virginia University, Ohio State. Pretty much most of those state universities or any of the A&T universities, agricultural and technical colleges are going to be land grant colleges. And so that's really promoting the idea of college as a thing, because previously it was only for the super wealthy. And really colleges before this were very local and didn't have a big national reach and didn't really promote a lot of scholarship to benefit industry and things like that. And so we're going to see that changing with the Morrill Act in, I think it was 1862. And we're going to see women gaining more responsibilities, both with job opportunities as field nurses during the Civil War. Obviously, the most famous is Clara Barton, who started the American Red Cross after the war. But we're also going to see that women, when the men are away working, the women take on business aspects at home, either running the farm or running the family business. And so that's going to lead to a lot of shifts after the Civil War of more women working outside the home in factories, more women taking jobs as nurses and teachers, leading into more of the re-rise of the suffragette movement in the late 1800s, leading into, of course, the 19th Amendment in 1920. And then the other huge social change, which we'll talk about more with Reconstruction, is the end of slavery and how we end up with 4 million freed African Americans who need to figure out what their life is going to look like after the war. And so that's a big topic for next part of this unit, looking at Reconstruction. So make sure you kind of understand the things that are going on around in the background of the actual war. And there you go.